Cheers, Rockets fans. Welcome to The Locker Line, an exclusive podcast from the home of the Rockets.
Whoa!
Sports Talk 790.
Rockets!
The Locker Line is proudly served to you by Carbox Clutch City Lager.
It is good! Oh, yeah?
Red Nation, get ready. Get ready. The Locker Line starts now.
Welcome aboard.
Thanks for checking out another fresh episode of The Lager Line, again served to you courtesy of Clutch City Lager of Carbach Brewing. I'm Ben Dubose, your host, editor of USA Today's Rockets Wire, and contributor to Sports Talk 790, official flagship radio station of your Houston Rockets. Paolo Alves, our usual co-host and producer, has been a bit under the weather the last few days. We hope to have him back in the not-too-distant future, but I did want to get an episode out in the interim because it's been a very good week for the Rockets ever since Green Thompson came back from that league suspension and joined the starting lineup in place of the injured Jabari Smith Jr. The Rockets are 4-0, and of those 4 wins, 3 have been of the statement variety, 1 against the Lakers with both LeBron James and Anthony Davis playing well, and 2 against the Memphis Grizzlies, your closest competition for the number 2 seed in the Western Conference. Rockets are now 26-12 and have a lead of 3 games in the loss column over both Memphis and Denver for a top 2 seed. And the Rockets, by virtue of going 3-0 against the Grizzlies in their 4 head-to-head meetings this season, have already clinched the tiebreaker in the event that the 2 teams end up tied at the end of this season. So lots to like on the court these days with the Rockets. 4 straight wins, 5 of 6 overall, a lot of cushion for the number 2 seed in the West as things stand on this Tuesday morning, January 14th. So I wanted to do a quick chat updating what we've seen the last few games and what some of the bigger takeaways are, especially within the context of the broader season and where the Rockets are wanting to go. For me, the obvious headliner is Jalen Green. I've been updating his stats on my Twitter timeline at PenDubose since Thanksgiving Eve, and they are incredible. In 19 games, that's officially half of the Rockets sample right now, Jalen is averaging almost 24 points per game on better than 60% true shooting. 47% from the field, almost 39% from 3, above 88% from the free throw line. He tied his career high in just a feel-good win over the Grizzlies on Monday night, 42 points, and really willed the Rockets back after Ja Morant hit a shot with 8 minutes left that put the Grizzlies up 12. It felt like, the Rockets made several runs, but that it just wasn't going to be enough. The Grizzlies clearly wanted that game and were playing hard after losing to the Rockets on their home court a few nights earlier. The Grizzlies are a good team. They're a top 5 offense, a top 5 defense. They went into Minnesota in between these 2 games against the Rockets. Of course, Houston had its game in Atlanta scrapped due to ice on Saturday. But Minnesota is a good team, and Memphis went out there and, led by Ja Morant down the stretch, executed and won the game when it mattered in a way that they could not do against the Rockets. And so for Houston to bounce back from a 12-point deficit with 8 minutes to go, it felt like undoing some of the damage and the scarring of that Minnesota game a few weeks ago. Not quite to that extent. Minnesota was down 16 to the Rockets with about 5 minutes left. In this case, the Rockets down 12 with 8 minutes left, but still a fantastic comeback. And Jalen Green was the big story. Every time it felt like the Rockets were on the verge of being knocked out, it seemed like Jalen had the answer right after Ja hit that 3 from nearly half court to put the Grizzlies up 12. Jalen responded with an and one that got the Rockets back to single digits, and it ended up sparking a 16-2 run as the Rockets put themselves in front entering the closing stages. And then, Jalen hit the game winner with 35 seconds left, and the Rockets stopped Ja Morant again down the stretch of that game. And Green and Thompson playing fantastic defense, as really he's done the entire year, but with the minutes being scaled up since he joined the starting lineup, it's even more obvious right now. And we heard from Jalen Green post-game. I thought his comment was very telling about a men being able to take on a heavier workload defensively. That's really helped Jalen to conserve more of his energy for the offensive end of the court. Because if you watched how Jalen got his points late against the Grizzlies, he took a pounding. That one where he fouled Zach Edey out and got to the free throw line, trying to jump over a 7'4" guy and absorbing that contact just to get a couple of free throws, that's tough. You need to be able to conserve your energy a bit with easier matchups on the defensive end. And that's what post-game Jalen was clearly tipping his hat to Green and Thompson for allowing him to do, even if he didn't want to fully spell it out that, hey, I'm taking some possessions off defensively. Come on, we know how this works. And so I would be very surprised for that reason and many others if Green and Thompson comes out of the starting lineup. I'll talk more about that in a few minutes because I want to lead off talking about Jalen Green, because I think Jalen, not just since the calendar turned to 2025, Rockets are 5-1 since then, and the only loss was to the defending NBA champion Boston Celtics on a night when you didn't have Green and Thompson, Jabari Smith Jr., or Tari Eason. So you were extremely shorthanded, and the defending champs for playing well. That's what it took to beat the Rockets. Other than that, they've been lights out since the calendar turned to 2025, and Jalen Green has been the biggest factor in why the Rockets have played at that level. And so I want to start talking about Jalen, not just in the micro, but in the macro, because I do think you can look at this recent stretch, maybe even the 19 games since Thanksgiving Eve, and say there's some small sample size theater to it, that he's just on a heater. And against the Grizzlies, look, he was outstanding, but 13 of 18 overall, 5 of 6 from 3. It's tough to be that efficient against air. So he is going to come back down to earth at some point. As this week closes out, the Rockets have a difficult road trip, 3 games in 4 nights, at Denver, at Sacramento, at Portland. I don't think you should expect Jalen Green to play like a top 10 player every single night the way he has for the last 6 or so games, really ever since we got to the new year. I think that would be an overreaction. I think, there's been a lot made of the improvements to Jalen's game since Green Thompson joined the starting lineup. I mentioned the defensive connection. I also think Green playing at a faster pace, what he offers at the dunker slot, being able to move without the ball, function as something of a lob threat. I think that benefits Jalen as well. But I also think, again, some of this is just simply Jalen being hot right now, in much the same way he had the untradeable tour about this time a year ago. And then we know what he did in March when he was very nearly Western Conference Player of the Month. I think some of it is hot shooting that will stabilize. There's perhaps some connection to Green joining the starting lineup, but I don't think it's as simple as saying Green joined the starting lineup and snap your fingers, everything has been fixed, and now Jalen is a stud. No, I don't think it's that simple. However, when you look back to really this time a year ago, Jalen over his last 78 games, and I posted this in an X thread, or an X post, I should say. God, I still want to call it Twitter. But ever since the last 40 games of last season and the first 38 of this season, so last 78 games, basically a full 82-game season, Jalen is averaging 21.7 points, 5.1 rebounds, 3.3 assists per game, shooting about 44% from the field, 34.5% on threes, 84% on free throws, true shooting percentage of right at 56. And he's averaging over 33 minutes per game during that stretch. That should tell you that he's defending well enough that Ime Udoka does not view him as a liability on that end. He's competing. And as far as winning, over the last 61 games of that sample, ever since the end of February last year, the Rockets are 42-19. That's a 69% win clip, which equates to a pace of 56-plus wins for a full season. And the reason I keep going back to the macro rather than the micro is that it incorporates both peaks and valleys. One of the things I really hate with some of the Jalen Green discourse is this focus on consistency and folks saying, well, even if the average numbers look pretty good in a given sample, he has so many peaks and valleys. You have these games where he looks breathtaking, tied his career high with 42 points against the Grizzlies, and others where he really struggles. Well, a lot of that comes with Jalen's archetype as a player. For guards, especially smaller guards, there is going to be more volatility because your formula depends on taking and ideally making a decent amount of threes and getting to the free throw line enough to boost your efficiency. Some nights you get the calls. He went to the line 11 times against the Grizzlies on Monday night, and we heard Jalen in the post-game locker room asked about his efficiency. He quickly pointed to that, the first words out of his mouth, basically saying, hey, you give me the calls, I'll look much more efficient because I'm getting to the line. And also those calls dictate how physical other teams can guard him. if Jalen gets to the line much more frequently, they're not going to be as handsy, they're not going to be as physical, and that's going to help him make more shots because it changes the way they defend him on his drives. So it's not just the free throws that he gets, it also influences the overall shot diet and how teams defend or don't defend him on a given night. But the bottom line is when you aren't a super freakishly large or athletic type of player. Now, Jalen is athletic, but he doesn't combine it with overwhelming size. You're not going to be getting the majority of your shots right at the rim. And so because of that, there's going to be more volatility. There always is if you're looking at guards, especially smaller guards in the NBA. And in Jalen's case, his archetype, his value is strictly as a scorer. You're not asking him to be a top shelf assist guy or a top shelf defender. I think sometimes if you're looking at someone who might average 10 assists per game, the volatility is still there for that player as a scorer, but it's not noted as much by the casual fan because if he's putting up 9, 10, 11 assists in a given game, he's still stuffing the stat sheet. He still looks really good on the box score, as opposed to for someone of Jalen's archetype, someone you want to be a tip of the spear scorer, if he's not doing the scoring at a high or efficient level, that's going to stand out much more because it's not like he has those other elements of his game to pick up the slack, at least statistically. Now, if you talk to people inside the building at Toyota Center, they'll say that even when Jalen is struggling, he still has a large impact on games because of his willingness and ability to take difficult shots, to challenge the defenses at all three levels, to draw attention on the scouting reports. Even if the shots aren't going in on a given night, there's still a certain gravity that Jalen has. That's actually a word that Green Thompson used post-game talking about the open looks he got in the fourth quarter off of Jalen Green drawing a second defender, and then either Steven Adams or Alperen Sengun making the play on the short roll and finding him in, often out of the dunker slot for either an easy bucket or drawing a foul to go to the foul line as he did in the final 10 seconds to put the game away. I think if you talk to people in the building, they'll say that even if Jalen shoots 5 for 15 on a given night, that there's still a lot more value than that because of how he changes the way defenses guard the Rockets and what he unlocks for other players. Yet, in terms of the discourse on social media and on TV shows and whatnot, that doesn't always get captured the same way it does with a point guard who's averaging 10, 11 assists per game. And so even if they score just 14 points on 5 of 15 shooting, something like that, well, if they're putting up a double-double, it's not going to stand out as much. With Jalen, it statistically stands out a lot more. And so I think that tends to drive the discourse a little bit and sometimes overly so. But to circle back to the main point in this little tangent, you need to compare apples to apples. Don't compare the volatility or lack thereof in a player like Giannis or Jokic and look at them as the superstar path that Jalen Green either needs to emulate or he's just not ever going to be at that level. He might not be at that level, but if he does get to that level, it's going to be with a very different formula. And so, again, I think some of the comps are just not taking into account who Jalen is as a player, what his efficiency formula is going to look like, because there are going to inherently be a lot of peaks and valleys. It's just par for the course when you have a player of Jalen Green's profile, his physical stature. The Rockets know that. So I think, sometimes that can lead to some flawed discourse just at the outset because an expectation is being put on Jalen Green, especially at 21, 22 years old, that's just unfair. With all that said, I would actually argue that because of that, it's even more important to look at the averages, the aggregate, the longer term trends. Some will point to the peaks and valleys and say, well, when he cleans that up, that's when he's really going to take the next step. No, that's always going to be there. And so because of that, it's even more important to look at the longer term trends, the hot games, the cold games, to let everything normalize and to see what the overall value looks like. And again, ever since really the midpoint of last year, he's averaging almost 22 points per game on about 56% true shooting, 5 boards, over 3 assists per game, respectable shooting. That's an above average starter at shooting guard, for a good NBA team. Actually, I call it a good starter for a very good team when you look at, again, a 56-plus win pace over their last 61 games. For Jalen at 22 years old to be doing that in a full season's worth of data, good starter on a very good team, that is tremendous. That is something that should be celebrated. Now, that's not to say that Jalen is the superstar that we all wanted him to be when he was drafted at number 2 overall in 2021. No, there's still another leap that he needs to make to get to that level. It would be very premature, just as it was last March, to say that Jalen has flipped a switch and that he's figured it out. No, until he does what he's done the last few games, maybe you can argue the last 19 games, on a much more permanent basis, I'm inclined to think that this is just one of the peaks, in much the same way that when he struggled coming out of the gate, really the first 3.5 weeks of November, that was a valley. I'm looking at this in the aggregate, looking at the longer term trend. But even if we consider that the fair representation, and I think it is, to be a good starter on a very good team at 22 years old, that's something to celebrate. That validates the extension at over $30 million a year that the Rockets gave to him before the season. That is not easy to do at 22 years old at a position where it's difficult to be a winning player because it's so easy to be inefficient and you aren't bringing value in all these other areas, or at least all these easily visible other areas. I think the bust scenarios are off the table. Jalen Green, we have enough evidence right now to say he is a good starter on a very good team. That should be celebrated. Now, does that mean that he's going to be here for 10, 15 years and he's going to win a championship as the best player on the Rockets in a few years? Not necessarily. We have established now that he is a good player. Whether he can become a great player in the same class as someone like Devin Booker or Donovan Mitchell, that's still to be determined. And we'll see if he can make that leap. But what I think we can celebrate today is that the bust scenarios are off the table. Jalen is good. He is contributing to winning right now, and he has done so for basically a full calendar year. There are still questions, and if he doesn't take another leap, he's still got time. Again, shooting guard is a tough position to make an impact from a winning perspective. It typically takes until guys get 23, 24, 25 years old before they can really do that on a consistent basis. So Jalen still has time. He might get there. He might not. And if he doesn't, then sure, we can talk about trade scenarios down the line. But what I think he has shown you right now is that he is not going to miss. Worst case, he's a solid player that will have certainly some value in trades. But best case, and this is why I don't think the Rockets are going to rush into trades, and I've been saying this for some time, the Rockets want to give this a longer runway, certainly the rest of this season and maybe beyond, to see if they don't have to make a big trade. If guys like Jalen can just take the next step organically and make it work with the current foundation, because certainly the last this stretch of January 2025, but really going back to Thanksgiving Eve, we're on a sharp upward trend in his trajectory. Time will tell as to how sustainable it is, but I think when you tie it back in with what we've seen really in the second half of last season, it's pretty clear that this is not just statistical noise. No, this is a good player, still to be determined if he can be great, but at 22 years old and just in year 4, he's got plenty of time. And in terms of why it sort of clicked for Jalen midway through last year, I would urge people to recall the specific circumstances that he had joining the Rockets as a 19-year-old out of the 2021 draft class. He was the one guy who had the most bad habits to shake. 2 full years of Stephen Silas fall and 2 full years as the focal point. He was not functioning largely as a role player, someone like Alperen Şengün or Tari Eason. Jalen Green was the focal point of multiple Stephen Silas years. I think he's the only player that you can say that about, and he plays a position where it is difficult to be a winning player because so much of the formula depends on efficiency. He's also undersized. He's not super physical. And so you're bringing in a coach like Ime Udoka that wants physicality on defense. And a lot of things had to change for Jalen Green. And I think because of that, it took him some time, longer than it did for other guys on the roster, to shake those bad habits, to be the player that Ime wanted him to be. We remember early last season, all the times that Jalen got benched in the fourth quarter because Ime just didn't trust him defensively. Again, that's stopped. Even on nights when Jalen isn't shooting well on the offensive end, he's still finishing games. Jalen is trusted by the coaching staff now. Again, averaging more than 33 minutes per game over basically the last year, the last 78 games. He's also insanely durable. Started over 140 games in a row, which in the load management era of the NBA speaks to how seriously he puts in work on his body in the offseason and staying in shape and getting more physical. We saw that on the game winner in which he absorbed some contact and finished at the rim. Great feel, great athleticism, great strength. So many things combined into one package. Jalen had to do a lot of work. He had to shake a lot of bad habits. So when you're looking at things he has to do physically, mentally, and all the normal things that accompany being 21, 22 years old in the NBA and at a difficult position to impact winning, it took him a little bit of time. But ever since the midway point of last season, he has been legitimately good. And I think we should celebrate that. And I think we should throw the bust scenarios in the trash. That's off the table. And I think, one reason this is sort of surprising people locally and certainly nationally, I think it's important to remember that while statistics get sorted on a season-by-season basis because it's more digestible that way, and the NBA crowns a new champion each season, when it comes to an individual player's development, those are arbitrary cutoff points. We can't act like each season is its own distinct entity because many times who a player is at the end of 6+ months and 80+ games is very different. Certainly with young players, they get better. And conversely, with older players, sometimes they slip a lot as a season progresses and they're in their 30s because they're on the downhill side of their careers. So that's where it's important to look at stats, not just through the lens of how they look on the front page of ESPN or Basketball Reference, showing you what they're doing in this current season, but also within the context of their careers. Because Jalen did not forget how to do what he did in March and January of last year. He just needed a larger sample so that it could all sort itself out and normalize. And that's what started to happen over certainly the last 6 games, but I would argue the last 19, ever since the day before Thanksgiving in Philadelphia when he went for 40+. Jalen did not forget how to do what he did in the second half of last season. He just got off to a bad start. And so because of that, really wasn't a bad start. He was good through the first 5 games and then just struggled for most of November, the first 14 games, if I recall. But because that was virtually the entire sample for this season, when you pull up his profile page on ESPN or NBA.com or whatever it may be, it looks worse than it is. It's so easy to say, hey, this is year 4. Typically when guys start to take the leap because they're eligible for contract extensions, and he's putting up numbers that are just unacceptable from an efficiency standpoint. It's easy to say that, but if you looked back to last season, and not just the month of March, but really the second half, it should have been clear that the 14 games that he struggled in early November, certainly not encouraging, but it also shouldn't have led to the level of despair that it did for certain corners of the fan base and certainly nationally, just the reputation of Jalen Green. There was always hope that with time, this could stabilize, and that's exactly what's happened. Now, I tend to believe that this current stretch is a little exaggerated. Amen might help him some, but I think a lot of it is just Jalen being hot. And until proven otherwise, I think he's probably going to revert back to the guy that he's been for most of the past year. Now, maybe that's being too bearish. Maybe he's turned another corner. I hope that's the case. Time will tell. Let's see how the next few months unfold as the Rockets get closer to what I think is at this point, assuming there are no major injuries, an inevitable playoff appearance. There's going to be playoff basketball at Toyota Center for the first time since 2019, and I am so freaking excited about it. But as far as Jalen, he's a good starter on a very good team. That's how I'm going to close the loop on this discussion, and you should celebrate it. The sample is not too small to say that. It is conclusive when you look back at how he finished last season, where he is halfway through this season, again, basically giving you a full season's worth of data, and you remind yourself, or you should remind yourself, that with young players, it doesn't always click in a symmetrical or linear fashion, that at the start of year 3 or the start of year 4, that's when he's going to take off statistically, and the front page of his ESPN profile is going to pop. No, sometimes it's midway through, a quarter of the way through, 3/4 of the way through a given season, and then it largely translates to the next season, but maybe the start is a little bumpy, which it was this year. It's not always going to be the most statistically digestible format. But if you look at the entirety of the data, I think enough is there to where we can confidently say this is not just a hot stretch for Jalen Green. He has figured out how to be a good, effective starter in the NBA, and that should be celebrated. Time will tell if he can go from good to great. I hope he can. I certainly wouldn't bet against him. But for now, I think we can say he is confirmed good. And given some of the dialogue as recently as a month or so ago, I think that's something we should celebrate, because Jalen's a guy who, again, he's, other than Jae'Sean Tate, the longest tenured guy on the roster. He's been through, certainly the highs now, but the lowest of lows his first couple of years. We know the vitriol he's taken on social media. And so to see him getting to the other side of it, I could not be more happy for him. Certainly for the Rockets individually, again, 26-12, and they've got more big games coming up at Denver tomorrow night. That's going to be big. But the big story is Jalen individually, because not only is he helping you win games now, in terms of the longer-term formula, he's showing you that at a bare minimum, he can be a valuable piece of that. And maybe he can be one of the lead pieces of that still. Again, only 22 years old. I know it feels like he's been here a while because it's year 4, but in NBA years, he's still pretty young in the grand scheme and still has lots of time to improve, as we've seen the last few weeks. All right. So to close out this episode, wanted to spend most of this, a mini episode without Paolo, who's been a bit under the weather. Want to talk about what we've seen from Jalen Green. I also want to talk about Green and Thompson, who has been tremendous since joining the starting lineup in place of Jabari Smith Jr. on a permanent basis. I think it's pretty clear that he is the best player on this team. We know how elite he is defensively with the athleticism, the versatility, the length, can basically guard anybody 1 through 5. Offensively, we know certainly how he can function off ball, but he's also doing a bit more on ball in terms of creation reps. And so the Rockets are able to transition Fred VanVleet to something more of an off-ball role. He shot only 5 shots last night, which, by the way, kudos to Fred for, despite not really being in rhythm, still making one of the biggest shots of the game, the 3 that put the Rockets up with about 4 minutes left. And Fred, even despite shooting just 5 times through the game, actually made 2 of his 3 from distance, including that big one in the final 4 minutes or so of that game. But Amen is a guy who, because of his ability to handle the ball, we know he was drafted as a point guard. The Rockets are leaning on him a little bit more, because when Jalen gets going, we know the way defenses are going to try to double and trap him, get the ball out of his hands. And so you need a release valve. And so Amen being able to function not just off the ball, but as someone who can actually drive and initiate when the ball is forced out of Jalen's hands, it's valuable. And it's something the Rockets are going to lean more into as Jalen's production increases and as he draws more attention from other teams who are determined to make someone other than Jalen Green beat them. So Amen, just a tremendous player. And again, I think it would be a little premature to say that Jalen Green has just miraculously figured it out solely because of Green and Thompson. Certainly not hurting, but I think some of this is hot shooting. But I do think that Amen is a good enough player overall. I would be stunned if he doesn't start the rest of the way. It won't be easy when Jabari Smith Jr. comes back, because he's been a starter for his first 2+ seasons in the league. But Amen is just better. And unless the results for the Rockets as a team, or Jalen and Amen individually, go down significantly over the next couple of weeks until Jabari comes back, likely in early February, I would be very surprised if Ime Udoka doesn't say, you know what, we're going to stick with what's working. Because the bottom line, Amen Thompson being able to play 36, 38 minutes per night That's how you get the best version of the Rockets. And will it be a little bit delicate with egos? For sure. It always is when you take someone who's been a starter out of the starting lineup. And in Jabari's case, I think he'd probably be the one coming out. Don't think Jabari's all that much worse than Dylan Brooks. It's just politically easier for Jabari to be the guy because A, he's younger, and B, he's out right now. So you can say, hey, we're just not going to take away from what's working. But I think, well, Jabari's not a huge ego guy to begin with. And even if he was, you can point to Tari Eason, someone drafted in the same draft class, who, when healthy, has probably been a better NBA player to this date than Jabari, and say, hey, if Tari can come off the bench, so can you. And I don't think Jabari is the type of guy who would look at it as a slight. They know how deep this team is. They know how good Amen Thompson is. They practice against him all the time. And so if someone has to take a seat for a men to get to 36, 38 minutes, I think ultimately they'll be willing to do it without rocking the boat. And I think Ime Udoka will do it as well. It won't be easy, but I just think if a men comes off the bench, I spelled this out before, but it's just impossible for him to get over 28 to 30 minutes per game because whoever starts is going to play the first 6 minutes of the first and third quarters, barring extreme foul trouble. Nobody makes a sub that early. It just doesn't make sense. If you're going to do that, why are you not just starting a player you're subbing in at like the 9-minute mark? And so if you're taking the first 6 minutes of the first and second halves off the table, there's only 36 minutes left to potentially play. And to play 36, you would have to literally play all 18 minutes consecutively in the first half and the second half. That's ridiculous. That's not going to happen. And so even if you want to play someone off the bench a majority of those minutes, they're going to at least have a 2 or 3 minute stint in each half where they catch their breath and they go to the bench. And so because of that, you're artificially capping them at, the 28 to 30 minute range, which Amen was averaging right at 28 minutes per game before he went in the starting lineup in place of Jabari. I know some will ask, well, the Rockets didn't make the change before. Why would they now? Because we're getting close to the playoffs and the Rockets are the number 2 seed in the Western Conference. I don't know if they're on the level of the Oklahoma City Thunder in terms of legit contention. I tend to think they're still not there. But if you're good enough to potentially get to the Western Conference Finals to be the second best team in a tough West, margins matter. Opportunity is not a lengthy visitor in the NBA. And I can't see Ime Udoka saying, yeah, we're just going to play Amen Thompson 6-8 minutes less per game for the sake of politics because it's easier politically in the locker room because I don't have to hurt someone's feelings. That does not sound like Ime Udoka to me. I think certainly last year, but even to start this year, it's a long season. There's a lot of players and things you're trying to evaluate. And so in that environment, you can say, you know what, even if we're not totally maxing out Amen Thompson, it's okay because there's a lot of things we're trying to balance. No, as you get into the second half of the season and closer to the playoffs on a team that's number 2 in the West, maximizing margins is going to matter. The Rockets are not going to act like, even if they're ahead of schedule organizationally, I think they are, that this season is irrelevant and that it's all gravy. No, there is an opportunity that comes when you are this good, and Amen Thompson is a big part of unlocking that opportunity and taking full advantage of it. And so I cannot see a scenario where come March, April, and hopefully May, he's not playing 36 plus minutes per night, assuming he's healthy. And for him to do that, he's going to have to start. Now, it doesn't have to be in place of Jabari. It could be in place of Dylan Brooks or somebody else, but I just think Jabari is someone who would be the cleanest swap because you keep the roles as they are right now, and you just say, well, we're not going to change up what's working, and we can reevaluate how everything looks in the offseason. Or who knows, maybe there's an injury somewhere else, and Jabari can step in at that time. Or maybe it's that bringing Jabari off the bench and having him as a backup 5 options for the matchups where Alperen Şengün is really struggling defensively, as we saw at times against the Grizzlies when they'd get a switch and Desmond Bane would cook Şengün one-on-one. Maybe it becomes easier to lean into the switchable Jabari at the 5 lineups if he's coming off the bench. I don't know. That's another thing. But I think far and away, the biggest consideration is how do you max out Amen Thompson's minutes? And for a team that's number 2 in the West, I don't think they're going to say, because it's easier in the locker room, we're going to go back to playing Amen 28 minutes. And if it hurts us a little bit, whatever. No, they're going to maximize their chances of winning. And that means maximizing the minutes of Green and Thompson. It's that simple. He is on a per minute basis the best player on this team already at just 21 years old in year 2. He is that good, and it's not a shot at anyone else on the roster, not Jabari, not anyone else that he might take the minutes from. It's just a compliment to Amen and how rare, how good his skill set is. And so I wouldn't attribute everything of this recent Jalen Green surge to Amen. Again, some of that goes back to hot shooting, but I do think that Amen makes the game easier for everyone. Certainly in some ways for Jalen, I think doing the heavier lifting defensively, as he hinted at after the Memphis game, that's part of it. But I think it just comes down to you're a better basketball team when Amen Thompson plays. Everyone benefits because of what he does on both ends of the court. And so because of that, you need to max out his minutes. That's going to resolve itself over the next few weeks because of the injuries to Jabari and Tari, no confirmed return dates for either. But even when those guys come back, Amen is in his own class. I think the Rockets know that. And so because of that, I would be very, very surprised, barring a downturn at a team level or Amen individually over the next couple of weeks. I would be very surprised if he comes out of the starting lineup. One last thing I want to hit on before we close out this mini pod. Cam Whitmore was great against the Grizzlies, 16 points, 6 of 9 shooting off the bench, 4 of 7 from 3. But I think the play he made at the end of the third quarter when the clock was running down and he could have pulled up for a mid-range shot, but he kicked it to Aaron Holiday in the corner for a buzzer-beating 3 that brought the Rockets back within 5 and really juiced up the environment at Toyota Center for the closing stretch of that game. That's something that Cam wouldn't have done even at the start of this year. That's why Ime Udoka has had a tight leash with him. That's why they've sent him to the G League. The talent is there. We know what he can do. We know he can score points at an NBA level when he rolls out of bed. But plays like that are the difference between good and great. I made that distinction with Jalen, and obviously there's things he's working on. With Cam, it's a little different in that physically his stature is different than Jalen Green. He has some gifts in terms of his size and power that Jalen doesn't. Now, Jalen is much more of a play creator. Cam at this point is a play finisher. So it was never an apples to apples comp. But for Jalen to improve, or for Cam, to improve on those deficiencies, he needs reps. And that's why even though it was delicate and clearly not easy on Cam, some of the body language stuff is certainly real. There's been some frustration. That's why the Rockets did it. To get from good to great, to mitigate those deficiencies, make him more of a team player, less tunnel vision, more aware in general. Offensively, to know where his teammates are. Defensively, not to get lost off the ball and in the maze of screens. He needs reps. With the injuries, he's got that with the Rockets right now, and I suspect he's shown enough that they'll find a way to keep him in the rotation even after everyone comes back. But that's why the Rockets sent him down to the G League earlier. That's why they've had a tight leash. The gifts are there, and he can be a good player as is, but he's not that far off from being a really good player. There's just some glaring deficiencies that keep him from reaching that next level. I think that game against the Grizzlies, certainly the play where he found Holiday with the assist, but also jumping the passing lanes, making some big steals defensively, that's that awareness off ball. You can see the light bulb turning on, and I think that's a victory for Ime Udoka in this organization as well. That's why they've had such a tight leash on him, to go back to that analogy. It hasn't been easy, not for Cam, not for the organization, because I think on some level, there's games where you could use Cam's juice, his scoring punch, when you just can't throw it in the ocean the way it felt like the Rockets had a stretch in December. But they are mindful of the bigger picture. And the bigger picture is to have a championship formula. You need to shore up some of these glaring deficiencies so there aren't these holes. That's why they sent Cam down, and we are seeing clear progress. So on an episode where we started talking about celebrating the win of Jalen Green, establishing a higher baseline, that's how I would frame it. I think another win we should celebrate, Cam Whitmore is making clear progress on some of those deficiencies that we saw Certainly last year as a rookie and coming out of Villanova, we know he was considered raw, and that's probably why he fell to 20 in the draft in 2023. But we are seeing those weaknesses improve. We are seeing exactly what the Rockets wanted him to work on pay dividends. And so that's a win that you should celebrate as well. Again, it's a little thing. I think statistically, that's always going to be what stands out. And he pours in 16 points in 21 minutes on good efficiency. But watch the little things. That's why they sent Cam down. And even if it led to some awkward body language at times and a weird interview and, the vibes aren't quite right, there's a bigger picture to this. That's why the Rockets did what they did. And if this works out as they hope and think that it will, then ultimately it's going to play a big role in achieving what we hope is a championship ceiling down the line for this team. Anyway, I'll bring the episode to a close right here. Just wanted to hit on what we saw certainly Monday night against the Grizzlies, but also just in general over the last few weeks of Houston Rockets basketball. Haven't had a lot of episodes here at the Logger Line because Paolo's been under the weather, but we're all feeling so good about the team today. I wanted to come out with something, and then hopefully we'll have a full episode later in the week as Paolo returns to health. Anyway, until our next full show, this is where I will break it. And if you want more content before then, follow me on Twitter/X at Ben Dubose, Paolo at Paolo Alves NBA, and the show at the Logger Line. If you hit the link tree in the bio, you can find links to our distributors, Apple, Google, Spotify. Subscribe, leave a positive review if you have not already. But also our friends, partners, sponsors of the program, Sports Talk 790, USA Today's Rockets Mark, Carbon Brewing. Hit up their links and you can enjoy their content as well. All right, with the pledge complete, we will adjourn. Until next time, I'm Ben Dubose, editor of USA Today's Rockets Wire, host of the Logger Line Pod. Thanks for listening, and please come back soon for another new episode. Go Rockets.